Imagine a powerful civilization, richer, smarter, more advanced than its time, wiped out in a single day and night, leaving almost no trace behind. Was Atlantis just a myth, or a warning from real history we're still ignoring today? Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe to Sky Aurora so you won't miss the full story and other mind-blowing historical mysteries. Imagine a story so powerful that it refuses to fade, even after more than 2,000 years have passed. A story that quietly survives the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the endless march of time. It is a story whispered in ancient manuscripts, argued over in universities, and chased across oceans by explorers who were convinced that somewhere, beneath the waves, the truth was still waiting. That story is Atlantis. The name alone feels heavy, almost alive. Atlantis, a city said to shine with unimaginable wealth, built with knowledge far ahead of its age. A civilization that mastered the sea, commanded vast lands, and stood as a symbol of human greatness. And then, without warning, it disappeared. No farewell, no survivors' chronicles, just silence, swallowed by the earth and the sea in a single day and night. For some people, Atlantis has always been nothing more than a myth, a beautiful lie created to entertain or to teach a lesson. For others, it is a historical wound, an unanswered question that continues to haunt our understanding of the ancient world. They believe Atlantis was real, that it existed, and that its remains are still hidden somewhere, waiting patiently to be discovered. This is where curiosity begins to burn, because legends usually fade. Fairy tales change shape over time, losing detail, becoming simpler, less convincing. But Atlantis does the opposite. The more it is examined, the more questions appear. The more scholars try to dismiss it, the more stubborn it becomes. It refuses to die. The story of Atlantis does not come from folklore passed down by anonymous voices. It comes from a specific source, a known individual, a philosopher whose works still shape modern thinking. That man is Plato. Around 360 BC, Plato wrote about Atlantis in his dialogues, presenting it not as a vague myth, but as a detailed account passed down through generations. He described its location, its structure, its political system, and even the reason for its destruction. This level of precision is unusual. It is one of the main reasons the story continues to disturb historians. According to Plato, Atlantis existed long before his time, in an age when gods and humans were said to interact more closely. It was an island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase commonly understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. In ancient terms, this meant the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay the vast, unexplored ocean. To Plato's audience, this alone made the story both terrifying and fascinating. Atlantis was not just far away, it was beyond certainty. Plato described Atlantis as incredibly advanced, not because of magic, but because of organization, discipline, and knowledge. Its people built complex systems of canals and harbors. They divided land with mathematical precision. They possessed a powerful navy and controlled trade routes that stretched across regions. This was not chaos. This was structure, a society that understood engineering, governance, and the importance of balance between land and sea. Yet the most striking part of the story isn't Atlantis' greatness, but its fall. According to Plato, the Atlanteans became consumed by power. Wealth made them arrogant. Success made them forget humility. Slowly, they lost the moral balance that once defined them. In Plato's telling, this decline was not sudden. It was gradual, human, and tragically familiar. And then came the punishment. In a single catastrophic event, earthquakes and floods struck. The land broke apart, the sea rose, and Atlantis vanished. Not over centuries, not through slow decay, but in one day and one night of unimaginable destruction. When morning came, the island was gone, replaced by an impassable sea of mud and debris. For this moment, the critical question is not, is Atlantis real, but rather, could Atlantis be based on something real? Could it be a memory of a true catastrophe, preserved and transformed over centuries of storytelling until it reached Plato in a refined philosophical form? This is why Atlantis continues to divide scholars. On one side are those who see it as a moral allegory, a story designed to warn societies about the dangers of greed and arrogance. Plato was, after all, a philosopher. He often used stories to communicate ideas. On the other side are those who argue that Plato was unusually clear that this account was true, not symbolic. He insisted the story came from ancient Egyptian records, preserved by priests and passed down carefully through generations. What makes this debate so powerful is that both sides have strong arguments. There is no physical proof of Atlantis as Plato described it, no ruins that can be clearly identified as the lost city, and yet there is also no definitive proof that Plato invented the story entirely. History sits uncomfortably between those two realities, and that discomfort is exactly why Atlantis still matters. It represents the fragile boundary between history and myth. It reminds us that much of the ancient world is lost, not because it never existed, but because time is ruthless. Civilizations rise, shine, and vanish, often leaving behind only fragments and questions. Tonight, we are not chasing fantasies of crystal towers or supernatural technology. We are here for facts, context, and historical reasoning. We are here to understand why a story written more than 2,000 years ago still refuses to be buried, why it continues to inspire books, expeditions, debates, and dreams. Atlantis may be gone, or it may never have existed as described, but the story itself is real, its impact is real, and the search for its truth tells us as much about humanity as it does about the past. This is the true beginning of the legend of Atlantis. Everything in the story of Atlantis begins with one man, a thinker whose influence is so deep that his ideas still shape how we understand philosophy, politics, and history today. His name is Plato. When Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BC, he was not a young storyteller chasing popularity, nor was he an entertainer inventing legends for amusement. He was already an established philosopher, a student of Socrates, and a teacher whose words carried serious weight in the intellectual world of ancient Greece. That context matters because it tells us something important from the very beginning. Plato was not someone who casually fabricated history. Plato introduced Atlantis in two of his works, Timaeus and Critias. These were not poems or mythical epics. They were philosophical dialogues, written as conversations between educated men discussing the nature of reality, politics, ethics, and the ideal society. Atlantis appears in this setting not as a side story, but as an example meant to support a larger discussion about human behavior, power, and moral decline. Yet what makes Atlantis stand out is how carefully Plato describes it. He gives dates, locations, and details that go far beyond what we would expect from a simple allegory. According to Plato, the story of Atlantis was not his own invention. He claimed it was passed down through a chain of sources, beginning with Egyptian priests, then carried to Greece by the lawmaker Solon, and finally preserved through generations until it reached him. In Plato's time, Egypt was considered a land of ancient wisdom, a place where knowledge was carefully recorded and protected. By linking Atlantis to Egyptian records, Plato was intentionally strengthening the credibility of the story. He wanted his audience to understand that this was not hearsay, but something rooted in ancient tradition. Plato described Atlantis as a powerful island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase that ancient Greeks used to describe the Strait of Gibraltar. In other words, Atlantis was said to lie outside the familiar Mediterranean world, beyond the edge of known geography. This detail is significant. Plato did not place Atlantis in a vague, imaginary realm. He placed it in a real direction, beyond a real landmark, suggesting a physical location rather than a symbolic one. In his account, Atlantis was not small or insignificant. It was rich in natural resources and strategically positioned. Its people had mastered engineering, building complex systems of canals, harbors, and defensive structures. The society was organized, disciplined, and powerful. Plato described a civilization that understood balance, combining human intelligence with respect for natural order. Atlantis, at its peak, was not portrayed as evil or monstrous. It was portrayed as admirable. However, this greatness did not last. According to Plato, the people of Atlantis slowly changed. As their wealth increased, their values shifted. Power bred arrogance. Prosperity gave way to greed. The moral discipline that once guided their society began to erode. This transformation is central to Plato's narrative because it reflects his broader philosophical concerns. Plato believed that societies collapse not because of external enemies alone, but because of internal decay. Atlantis, in his telling, became a victim of its own success. Then comes the moment that has captured human imagination for centuries. In a single day and night, Atlantis was destroyed. Plato described massive earthquakes and floods that shattered the land and swallowed the island into the sea. When the disaster ended, Atlantis was gone. Not ruined, not conquered, gone. The sea above it became impassable, filled with mud and debris, erasing any clear trace of what once existed there. What makes this account so unsettling is how direct Plato is. He never writes, "This is a myth." He never hints that the story should be read symbolically. On the contrary, he repeatedly presents it as a true historical account. For Plato, Atlantis was not a metaphor floating in imagination. It was an event that had happened long before his own time, but close enough to be remembered through records and oral tradition. This is where the mystery truly begins. If Atlantis was only meant as a philosophical lesson, why include such specific geographic references? Why describe the size of the island, the structure of its capital, and the exact nature of its destruction? Ancient myths usually thrive on ambiguity. They avoid details that can be challenged. Plato did the opposite. He anchored Atlantis in time and space. At the same time, Plato was a philosopher, not a historian in the modern sense. His goal was not to document events with archaeological precision. His goal was to explore truth, morality, and the ideal state. This creates a tension that still divides scholars today. Some argue that Atlantis was a carefully constructed fictional example designed to support Plato's ideas about virtue and corruption. Others argue that Plato believed the story to be true and saw no reason to doubt the sources he inherited. What complicates the issue further is the fact that Critias, the dialogue where Atlantis is described in the greatest detail, ends abruptly. The story cuts off before Plato finishes his account. There is no dramatic conclusion, no final reflection. It simply stops. Some believe this was intentional. Others believe the work was never completed. Either way, the absence of closure only deepens the mystery, leaving readers with questions instead of answers. It is also worth remembering that Plato lived in a world where the past was already ancient. Events separated by hundreds or thousands of years were difficult to verify. Natural disasters could erase entire cultures, especially island societies. Oral traditions could preserve memories while altering details. In such a world, the line between history and legend was thin, and Plato stood right on that line. By presenting Atlantis as real, Plato forced his audience to confront an uncomfortable idea that even the most advanced civilization could be wiped out suddenly, not by foreign invasion, but by the forces of natural nature and its own moral failure. That is why Atlantis has endured, not because it promises lost treasure or secret technology, but because it asks a timeless question. If a great civilization could vanish in a single day and night, what does that say about our own? Plato may have started the story, but he also opened a door that has never fully closed, and once that door was opened, the mystery of Atlantis could no longer be ignored. Atlantis, according to Plato, was never meant to be understood as a single city standing alone on the edge of the sea. It was far greater than that. Atlantis was an empire, a vast and organized power whose influence reached far beyond its own shores. When Plato described it, he spoke with the confidence of someone recounting a remembered reality, not inventing a fantasy. His Atlantis was complex, deliberate, and carefully designed, a civilization that reflected human intelligence at its highest point in the ancient world. At the heart of Atlantis stood its capital, and this is where Plato's description becomes strikingly vivid. The city was built in a series of massive concentric rings, alternating between land and water. These circular zones were not decorative, they were functional, defensive, and symbolic of order. Bridges connected each ring, allowing controlled movement inward toward the center. Canals were carved with precision, wide enough for ships to pass through, turning the city itself into a living harbor. Water was not an obstacle for the Atlanteans, it was their greatest advantage. This design alone suggests advanced planning and engineering knowledge. Building such a system required an understanding of geometry, hydraulics, and long-term urban development. The canals were not random trenches, they were carefully measured, reinforced, and maintained. Plato described walls faced with metals that reflected light, giving the city a brilliance that astonished visitors. To the ancient mind, this level of construction bordered on the unimaginable, yet it remained grounded in physical possibility. Atlantis was also wealthy beyond comparison. The land was fertile, producing crops in abundance. Rivers and plains supported agriculture on a massive scale. The surrounding sea provided fish and access to trade routes. Plato emphasized that the Atlanteans did not struggle for survival. Their environment gave them everything they needed, and their skill allowed them to multiply those gifts. Wealth flowed naturally, not through exploitation at first, but through harmony with their surroundings. Among the resources Plato mentioned, one stands out and has puzzled readers for centuries: aurichalcum. He described it as a rare and precious metal, second only to gold in value. In Atlantis, aurichalcum was not scarce. It was used widely, decorating walls, temples, and public buildings. Some modern scholars believe aurichalcum may have been an early alloy, possibly similar to brass, known to ancient Mediterranean cultures. Others argue it may have been a symbolic term for wealth itself. Whatever it truly was, its presence reinforces the image of Atlantis as a civilization rich in material knowledge. But Atlantis was not powerful merely because of its resources. It was powerful because of its organization. Plato described a society governed by laws, ruled by kings who were bound by tradition and responsibility. The Atlantean rulers were not absolute tyrants. They operated within a structured system that valued order and balance. For a long time, this system worked. Atlantis prospered without descending into chaos. Militarily, Atlantis was formidable. Its navy dominated the seas. Ships were plentiful, well-built, and expertly crewed. The Atlanteans understood naval warfare and logistics, giving them control over vast regions. Their armies were equally disciplined, trained not only to defend their homeland, but also to project power abroad. Plato wrote that Atlantis once attempted to expand its influence across the Mediterranean, challenging other great powers of the ancient world. This is an important detail because it places Atlantis within the context of real human behavior. Empires expand, prosperity breeds ambition, success encourages overreach. Atlantis followed the same path that many historical civilizations would later follow. It did not collapse because it was weak, it collapsed because it became too strong for its moral foundations. Yet, despite its military might, Atlantis was not destroyed by war. This is the detail that many people overlook or misunderstand. Plato was clear on this point. Atlantis did not fall to an enemy army. Its walls were not breached by invaders. Its navy was not defeated in battle. Instead, its destruction came from nature itself. According to Plato, a
catastrophic natural event struck with overwhelming force. Earthquakes shattered the land, floods surged across the island. The carefully designed rings of land and water could not withstand the violence unleashed upon them. In a single day and night, the empire that had taken generations to build was undone. The sea swallowed the land, and the land dragged the city down with it. This kind of destruction would have been terrifyingly believable to ancient audiences. They lived in a world where natural disasters were sudden and devastating. Entire coastal settlements could vanish after a single earthquake or tsunami. Islands were especially vulnerable. When Plato described Atlantis sinking beneath the sea, he was not invoking magic. He was invoking a known and feared reality. What makes this even more compelling is the aftermath Plato described. He did not claim that Atlantis left behind glorious ruins waiting to be explored. Instead, he wrote that the area became impassable, filled with mud and debris. This detail suggests a violent geological event, one that reshaped the sea floor and erased clear traces of what once existed. In such conditions, even the greatest city could disappear without leaving obvious remains. This portrayal of Atlantis forces us to confront a sobering truth. Advanced civilizations are not immune to collapse. Engineering, wealth, and power offer no protection against the forces of nature when they strike at full strength. Plato's Atlantis was not destroyed because it lacked intelligence. It was destroyed because intelligence alone cannot control the earth. And yet, there is also a moral dimension woven into the physical catastrophe. Plato suggested that the gods withdrew their favor when Atlantis lost its virtue. To modern readers, this may sound symbolic, but to ancient audiences, it reflected a worldview where moral balance and natural order were deeply connected. When humans became arrogant, nature responded. Whether one interprets this as religious belief or philosophical storytelling, the result is the same. Atlantis becomes a mirror. It reflects humanity at its most capable and its most vulnerable. It shows us a society that achieved greatness through discipline and harmony, then lost it through excess and pride, and finally vanished through forces beyond its control. So when we imagine Atlantis, we should not picture a mystical fantasy land detached from reality. We should picture an ancient empire, built with knowledge, sustained by resources, organized by law, and ultimately undone by the same world that allowed it to rise. That is why the image of Atlantis remains so powerful. It is not just the image of a lost city, it is the image of human ambition standing on unstable ground, beautiful, brilliant, and always one disaster away from silence.
As the story of Atlantis traveled through centuries, one question began to dominate every serious discussion about it. Was Atlantis meant to be taken literally, as a lost chapter of human history, or was it a carefully constructed moral warning, shaped by philosophy rather than memory? For many historians, the answer has always leaned towards skepticism. They argue that Atlantis was never intended to be real in the physical sense. Instead, they believe it was a powerful teaching tool, a fictional society designed to communicate a deeper truth about human nature. In ancient Greece, this method of teaching was not unusual. Philosophers often used imagined cities, ideal states, or symbolic narratives to explore ideas that were difficult to explain directly. These stories were not lies, they were frameworks. They allowed listeners to see complex concepts played out in a concrete way. Through fictional societies, philosophers could examine justice, corruption, power, and virtue without pointing fingers at real governments or individuals. In this tradition, Atlantis fits perfectly. It becomes a warning about what happens when a society loses its moral balance. From this perspective, Atlantis represents the rise and fall of human ambition. It begins in harmony, guided by discipline and wisdom. Over time, success breeds arrogance, wealth dulls humility, power replaces restraint. Eventually, collapse becomes inevitable. This arc mirrors countless real civilizations, from ancient empires to modern states. As a moral lesson, Atlantis is almost timeless. It reminds every generation that no amount of power can protect a society from its own excesses. This interpretation also aligns neatly with the philosophical goals of Plato. Plato was deeply concerned with the nature of justice and the ideal form of government. He believed that societies should be ruled by wisdom rather than desire, by reason rather than greed. Atlantis, when read as philosophy, becomes the opposite of his ideal state. It is what happens when reason is overtaken by appetite, when moral order collapses under the weight of success. For many scholars, this is where the story should end. Atlantis, in their view, was never meant to be dug up by archaeologists or located on a map. It was meant to be understood, reflected upon, and internalized. The tragedy of Atlantis was not its physical destruction, but its ethical failure. The sinking of the island becomes a dramatic conclusion to a lesson that Plato wanted his audience to remember. And yet, there is a problem with this explanation, a significant one. Plato was unusually specific. Most fictional allegories avoid concrete details. They stay flexible, allowing readers to focus on meaning rather than accuracy. Plato did not do this with Atlantis. He included dates, claiming the events occurred thousands of years before his own time. He described precise locations, placing Atlantis beyond known geographical boundaries, but still anchoring it to real landmarks. He outlined the physical structure of the city, its size, its layout, its resources, and even the composition of its buildings. These are not the habits of a storyteller who wants his audience to think symbolically. Even more unsettling is Plato's insistence on the origin of the story. He did not present Atlantis as a hypothetical example. He claimed it was a true account preserved by Egyptian priests and passed down through trusted hands. In ancient Greek culture, Egypt represented antiquity, stability, and recorded knowledge. By linking Atlantis to Egyptian records, Plato was not weakening his story, he was reinforcing it. He was saying, in effect, that this was history older than Greece itself. This level of commitment raises an uncomfortable question. Why would Plato go to such lengths if Atlantis were purely fictional? Why risk his credibility by presenting an invented story as historical fact? Plato was well aware of the difference between myth and history. He openly labeled myths as myths in other works. With Atlantis, he did not. Instead, he repeatedly emphasized its truthfulness. Some historians argue that Plato may have believed the story himself, even if it was not accurate. In this view, Atlantis becomes a misunderstood tradition rather than a deliberate invention. Plato may have inherited fragments of an ancient tale, possibly rooted in real events such as natural disasters, and reshaped them into a narrative that fit his philosophical framework. If this is the case, Atlantis exists in a gray area between fact and interpretation. This idea helps explain why Atlantis feels different from other myths. It lacks gods performing miracles or heroes wielding supernatural powers. The destruction of Atlantis comes not from divine warfare, but from earthquakes and floods. These are natural forces, familiar and terrifying to ancient peoples. Nothing about the catastrophe violates the laws of nature. It simply overwhelms human control. Another detail that complicates the purely symbolic interpretation is the reaction Plato seems to expect from his audience. He does not encourage disbelief. He does not invite debate over whether Atlantis existed. Instead, he moves forward as if its reality is assumed, using it as a foundation for further discussion. This suggests that, at the very least, Plato wanted his readers to take the possibility seriously. Over time, this ambiguity has become the most powerful aspect of the Atlantis story. If it were clearly fictional, it would have faded like many philosophical examples before it. If it were clearly historical, it would have been resolved through evidence or disproven conclusively. Atlantis survives because it is neither. It sits in the uncomfortable space between what can be proven and what cannot be fully dismissed. The debate over Atlantis is not really about ruins beneath the sea. It's about how we understand the past. Ancient history is fragile, records are incomplete, memories are distorted by time, natural disasters erase evidence, oral traditions reshape events.
In such a world, certainty is rare. Atlantis reminds us of that uncertainty and challenges our confidence in clear categories like myth and history. Perhaps this is why Atlantis continues to provoke such strong reactions. Some people desperately want it to be real because it suggests that human civilization once reached heights we have forgotten. Others desperately want it to be fictional because the idea of a powerful society vanishing overnight is deeply unsettling. Both reactions reveal something about our fears and hopes. So the question remains unresolved. Was Atlantis history, preserved imperfectly through time, or was it philosophy, crafted to teach a lesson more effectively than abstract argument ever could? The uncomfortable truth may be that it was both, a real memory, shaped by catastrophe, refined by storytelling, and finally transformed by philosophy into something larger than itself. And that is why Atlantis refuses to disappear, not because it hides beneath the ocean, but because it lives in the unresolved tension between what we know and what we can never fully prove.
Around 1600 BC, the ancient world experienced a catastrophe so immense that its effects were felt far beyond the place where it began. On the island we now know as Santorini, called Thera in antiquity, the earth itself tore open. What followed was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded human history, an event so violent that it permanently reshaped the landscape of the Aegean Sea and altered the course of an entire civilization. This was not a simple volcanic outburst. It was a massive explosion that released energy comparable to tens of thousands of atomic bombs. The center of the island collapsed inward, forming a vast caldera. Entire sections of land vanished in moments. Settlements that had thrived for generations were erased almost instantly, buried under layers of ash, rock, and molten debris. For the people living there, there was no time to adapt, no slow decline, only sudden and overwhelming destruction. The eruption did not stop at the island itself. Towering columns of ash shot high into the atmosphere, spreading across the Mediterranean. For days, possibly weeks, the sky darkened, sunlight was dimmed, ash fell on distant lands, disrupting agriculture and poisoning water supplies. This was not a local disaster, it was a regional crisis that rippled outward in every direction. Then came the sea. When the volcano erupted and parts of the island collapsed, enormous volumes of water were displaced. This triggered massive tsunamis that raced across the Aegean at terrifying speed. Coastal settlements were struck with little warning, harbors were destroyed, ships were smashed against rocks or dragged far inland. For island societies that depended on the sea for trade, food, and connection, this was catastrophic. At the center of this unfolding disaster stood one of the most advanced cultures of the Bronze Age, the Minoan Civilization. Long before classical Greece rose to prominence, the Minoans had built a sophisticated society centered on the island of Crete and its surrounding territories. They were master sailors, skilled traders, and accomplished builders. Their cities featured complex architecture, multi-story buildings, paved roads, and advanced drainage systems. Their art revealed a culture that valued beauty, movement, and life. The Minoans dominated the Aegean Sea through their naval power. Their ships connected islands and distant coasts, creating a vast network of trade. They exchanged goods, ideas, and technologies with Egypt, the Near East, and mainland Greece. For centuries, they flourished. They were, in many ways, an island empire. When the eruption of Thera occurred, it struck at the heart of this world. Although the main island of Crete was not completely destroyed by lava, the effects of the eruption were devastating. Tsunamis battered coastal cities, ashfall damaged crops and poisoned fields. Trade routes were disrupted, ports were rendered unusable. The Minoan economy, which depended heavily on maritime dominance, was shaken to its core.
What makes this event especially haunting is how closely it echoes the story told by Plato centuries later. An advanced island-based civilization, a sudden natural catastrophe, destruction not by war but by forces beyond human control. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of the disaster. Excavations on Santorini reveal entire towns frozen in time beneath thick layers of volcanic ash. Buildings collapsed, streets buried, everyday objects left exactly where people had last used them. It is a scene eerily similar to what we see at Pompeii, but far older and far larger in scale. On Crete, layers of destruction align with the time frame of the eruption, indicating widespread damage and disruption. The Minoans did not vanish overnight. History is rarely that simple. But the eruption marked a turning point from which they never fully recovered. In the weakened state that followed, they became vulnerable to outside pressures, including invasion from mainland Greece. Within a few generations, their dominance faded, and their civilization was absorbed into the rising Mycenaean world. From a historical perspective, this sequence makes sense. Natural disasters often do not end civilizations outright. Instead, they destabilize them, breaking systems that took centuries to build. Recovery requires time, resources, and stability. When those are lacking, decline accelerates. The fall may appear sudden in hindsight, even if it unfolded over decades. Now consider how such an event would be remembered without modern science, without written records preserved across continents. Imagine survivors passing down stories of the day the Earth exploded, the sea rose, and the sky darkened. Over generations, these memories would change, details would blur, timelines would stretch. The destruction of a powerful island culture could become the story of a single lost land, swallowed by the sea in a day and a night. This is where history and memory begin to intertwine. Plato wrote about Atlantis more than 1,000 years after the eruption of Thera. By then, the Minoans were long gone. Their language was forgotten. Their cities lay in ruins. But echoes of their world may have survived in myths, songs, and foreign records. What Plato recorded may not have been a precise historical report, but a distant reflection of a real catastrophe, magnified by time. Importantly, nothing about the Thera eruption requires supernatural explanation. Volcanic explosions, tsunamis, and atmospheric disruption are well-documented phenomena. We know they happen. We know they have wiped out communities and reshaped regions throughout history. In this sense, the destruction of an advanced island civilization by natural forces is not extraordinary. It is tragically plausible. This realization changes how we view the Atlantis story. It no longer feels like pure fantasy. It begins to resemble a cultural memory of real events, filtered through centuries of retelling and philosophical interpretation. Atlantis does not need to have existed exactly as Plato described to be rooted in truth. It only needs a powerful original event, one dramatic enough to survive the erosion of time. The eruption of Santorini was such an event. It stands as a reminder that even the most advanced societies of their time are vulnerable. Wealth, technology, and organization offer no guarantee of survival when nature turns violent. One moment a civilization thrives, the next it struggles to breathe beneath ash-darkened skies. When we hear Plato's words about an advanced island civilization destroyed suddenly by nature, we are no longer listening to an impossible story. We are listening to something that has already happened before. And once that realization settles in, the mystery of Atlantis feels far less distant and far more unsettling.
When historians and archaeologists began to seriously question whether Atlantis could be connected to a real civilization, one candidate kept returning to the center of the discussion: the Minoan Civilization. Not because the Minoans matched every detail Plato described, but because, in many crucial ways, they fit the pattern too well to ignore. They were advanced, wealthy, sea-focused, and powerful. They lived on islands. They relied on the ocean for survival and influence. And when their world changed, it changed with shocking speed. Long before classical Greece reached its height, the Minoans were already thriving. Centered on the island of Crete and nearby Aegean islands, they built cities that astonish modern archaeologists even today. Their architecture was complex and intentional. Palaces like Knossos were not simple royal residences, but massive administrative centers with multiple stories, interconnected rooms, courtyards, storage facilities, and advanced drainage systems. Some buildings even show evidence of plumbing and water management that would not become common again for centuries. This level of construction required planning, skilled labor, and deep knowledge of engineering. Nothing about Minoan cities suggests a primitive or chaotic society. On the contrary, everything points to organization, stability, and long-term vision. This alone begins to echo Plato's description of Atlantis as a civilization that had mastered both land and structure. Beyond their cities, the Minoans were defined by the sea. Crete's geography made maritime skill a necessity, and the Minoans embraced it fully. They built powerful fleets and became dominant sailors of the Aegean world. Through these fleets, they established complex trade networks that connected them to Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and mainland Greece. Goods, ideas, and cultural influences flowed through Minoan ports, turning them into hubs of the ancient world. This maritime dominance is a key parallel. Plato emphasized that Atlantis was a naval power, capable of projecting influence across wide regions. The Minoans were exactly that. Their control of sea routes allowed them to prosper without constant warfare. For a long time, they appear to have relied more on trade and diplomacy than on large standing armies. Their strength lay in ships, ports, and economic reach. Minoan art also reveals a civilization that was confident and sophisticated. Their frescoes depict fluid movement, natural scenes, ceremonial life, and harmony with the environment. Unlike many ancient cultures, Minoan art rarely glorifies war. Instead, it emphasizes balance, beauty, and ritual. This suggests a society that, at least for a time, lived in relative stability and abundance. All of this paints a picture of a civilization that could easily be remembered as great, even legendary, by those who came after. When such a society suffers a dramatic decline, its memory does not simply vanish, it lingers, especially if the fall is sudden and traumatic. This is where the eruption of Thera becomes impossible to separate from the discussion. The volcanic disaster did not merely damage buildings or disrupt trade, it shattered the foundations of Minoan power. Coastal cities were hit by tsunamis, ports were destroyed, agricultural systems were damaged by ash. Communication across the sea became dangerous or impossible. For a civilization whose identity and survival were tied to maritime control, this was devastating. What followed was not an immediate disappearance, but a rapid weakening. The Minoans struggled to recover. Their fleets lost dominance, their trade networks fractured, and in this vulnerable state, they faced increasing pressure from external forces, particularly the rising Mycenaean Greeks. Within a relatively short span of time, Minoan independence faded, and their culture was absorbed into a new political order. From the perspective of later generations, this decline could easily appear sudden and absolute. Especially without detailed written records, the nuance of decades can collapse into the memory of a single catastrophic moment. A great island civilization, once powerful and admired, gone. Now, imagine how such an event would survive in human memory. Stories would be told by survivors, traders, and neighboring cultures. They would speak of a time when the earth shook, the sea rose, and darkness covered the sky. They would speak of cities destroyed and power lost. Over centuries, these stories would change. They would simplify. They would merge events. Geography would shift. Timelines would stretch. By the time Plato encountered these traditions, he may not have been hearing about the Minoans directly. He may have been hearing an echo, a distant memory of a real disaster filtered through generations of oral storytelling and cultural reinterpretation. What he recorded as Atlantis may have been a philosophical reconstruction of that memory, shaped to serve his ideas about power, morality, and decline. This theory explains both the similarities and the differences between Atlantis and Minoan Crete. Atlantis, as Plato described it, was larger, more powerful, and more unified than the Minoans ever were. Its destruction was total and immediate, while the Minoans declined over time. These differences matter. They remind us that Atlantis is not a historical report in the modern sense, but the similarities matter just as much. An advanced island-based civilization, strong naval power, wealth and organization, sudden devastation caused by natural forces. These are not vague coincidences. They form a pattern that aligns remarkably well with what we know about the Minoans and the Thera eruption. Many modern historians do not claim that Atlantis was literally Minoan Crete. Instead, they argue something more subtle and more compelling. Atlantis may be a distorted memory of real events, transformed by time, storytelling, and philosophy. Not exact, not precise, but rooted in truth. This idea forces us to reconsider how ancient history survives. The past does not reach us untouched. It arrives fragmented, reshaped by human minds trying to make sense of trauma and loss. Great disasters often become myths, not because they are false, but because they are too overwhelming to be remembered plainly. In this light, Atlantis becomes less of a mystery and more of a mirror. It reflects how humans remember catastrophe, how real suffering becomes symbolic, how history becomes story. The Minoans may not have called their land Atlantis, and they may not have vanished in a single night, but their world did break apart, and its memory may have traveled far beyond its ruins. If Atlantis is indeed rooted in the fall of Minoan Crete, then it was never meant to be found as a city beneath the sea. It was meant to survive as a warning, preserved not in stone, but in story. And perhaps that is why, even today, when we hear about a powerful island civilization destroyed by nature, it feels hauntingly familiar. As the legend of Atlantis spread beyond ancient texts and into the modern imagination, it did not remain anchored to a single location. Instead, it began to travel. Over the centuries, Atlantis has been discovered again and again in wildly different parts of the world. Each new era, armed with its own maps, technologies, and hopes, placed Atlantis where mystery still lingered, and so the search expanded, crossing oceans, continents, and even polar ice. For some, Atlantis had to be somewhere in the vast Atlantic Ocean. The name itself seemed like a clue too obvious to ignore. Early explorers and later theorists imagined a massive landmass once stretching between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, later swallowed by the sea. This idea gained popularity during the Age of Exploration, when the ocean still felt endless and largely unknown. Shipwrecks, strange underwater formations, and incomplete maps fueled speculation. If entire continents could be misdrawn or misunderstood, why not a lost civilization? Yet, as oceanography advanced, this theory began to collapse. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been mapped in increasing detail. Its geological structure shows no evidence of a sunken continent that disappeared in historical times. The seafloor is shaped by tectonic plates that move slowly over millions of years, not by sudden collapses of entire landmasses within a single day and night. While parts of land can sink due to earthquakes or volcanic activity, the idea of a vast Atlantic empire vanishing whole does not align with what science tells us about the Earth's crust. Others shifted their attention westward toward the Caribbean. Here, shallow waters, submerged structures, and ancient indigenous legends combined into a compelling narrative. Stories of the lost city of Bimini, underwater stone formations, and mysterious alignments captured public attention, especially in the 20th century. Some claimed these formations were roads or walls built by an ancient civilization far older than any known in the Americas. But when archaeologists examined these sites carefully, the excitement faded. What appeared mysterious at first often turned out to be natural rock formations shaped by erosion and geological processes. The Caribbean theories relied heavily on interpretation rather than evidence. No tools, inscriptions, or cultural layers emerged to support the existence of a technologically advanced global empire. The sea, it seemed, was playing tricks on the human imagination. Then there are theories that push Atlantis to the far edges of the world. One of the most dramatic places proposed is Antarctica. According to this idea, Atlantis was once a temperate land that later froze over after a sudden shift in the Earth's crust. Proponents point to ancient maps that appear to show Antarctica without ice, suggesting forgotten knowledge of a lost civilization. This theory is undeniably dramatic, but it collapses under scientific scrutiny. Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years, long before humans ever appeared. While climate changes have occurred, there is no credible evidence that a human civilization could have existed there within any historical time frame. The ancient maps often cited are better explained as misinterpretations or artistic guesses rather than accurate depictions of an ice-free continent. More recently, attention has turned eastward towards Southeast Asia. Some researchers point to ancient flood myths, submerged coastlines, and the vast landmass known as Sundaland, which existed during the last ice age when sea levels were lower. As the ice melted, large areas were flooded, potentially displacing human populations and erasing settlements beneath rising waters. This idea is more grounded than many others. We know sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age. We know human populations lived along coastlines that are now submerged. It is entirely possible that early societies were lost to the sea, leaving behind stories of great floods and vanished lands. However, even here, the leap to Atlantis is problematic. While submerged settlements may exist, there is no evidence of a single unified globe-spanning empire with the power and structure Plato described. And this pattern repeats everywhere Atlantis is placed. Each location offers mystery, each offers gaps in our knowledge, but none provide the archaeological proof required to confirm Atlantis as a lost global superpower. No inscriptions naming Atlantis, no unique technology beyond what we already know, no material culture that cannot be connected to existing civilizations. This is the hard truth that often gets lost beneath excitement and speculation. Archaeology is not built on imagination, but on evidence. Pottery shards, tools, building foundations, written records, these are the fingerprints of real civilizations. Atlantis, despite centuries of searching, has left none that can be conclusively identified. What serious academic theories consistently do instead is connect Atlantis back to known ancient cultures, civilizations we can study, societies whose ruins we can excavate, peoples whose rise and fall we can trace through layers of soil and stone. The Minoans, the Egyptians, Mesopotamian flood narratives, even early Mediterranean cultures affected by earthquakes and tsunamis. These are the real foundations beneath the Atlantis story. This does not make the search foolish, it makes it human. People search for Atlantis because it represents loss on a grand scale. It represents the fear that knowledge can vanish, that progress is fragile, that history is incomplete. The idea that something magnificent once existed and was erased without a trace is both terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying because it suggests we are vulnerable, comforting because it suggests we are part of a long cycle, not a unique moment. The global search for Atlantis also reveals something about the modern world. As the map fills in and mystery shrinks, we push legends further away into deeper oceans, older eras, and more remote places. Atlantis keeps moving, not because it is being found, but because it cannot survive scrutiny in any one location. In the end, Atlantis does not belong to a single point on the map. It belongs to the space between what we know and what we wish were true. Every serious study brings us back to the same conclusion. Atlantis, as a powerful empire that ruled the world and vanished overnight, has never been proven to exist. And yet, the stories that inspired it are real. Floods happened, civilizations fell, islands were shattered, people remembered. Perhaps that is why Atlantis continues to be found everywhere and nowhere at once. Not because it is hiding beneath the sea, but because it lives in humanity's collective memory, reshaped at culture, geography, and imagination. And until our fascination with lost greatness fades, the search for Atlantis will continue to circle the globe, chasing a truth that may never have been meant to be pinned to one place at all. Atlantis has never been just a story about a lost city. If it were only that, it would have faded long ago, buried alongside countless other ancient legends that no longer stirred debate or emotion. Atlantis endures because it touches something far deeper than geography or archaeology. It speaks directly to the human experience, to our fears, our hopes, and the quiet questions we rarely say out loud. At its core, Atlantis is about fear. Not the sudden fear of danger, but the slow, unsettling fear that even the greatest achievements are fragile. That no matter how advanced a civilization becomes, no matter how wealthy, organized, or intelligent it is, collapse is always possible. Atlantis reminds us that progress is not permanent. It suggests that history does not move in a straight line upward, but in cycles of rise and fall. This idea is deeply uncomfortable, especially in a world that prides itself on technology, science, and control over nature. When people hear the story of Atlantis, they are not just imagining a city sinking beneath the waves. They are imagining libraries lost forever, knowledge erased, art destroyed, wisdom silenced. They're imagining a moment when everything people believed was stable suddenly was not. That fear feels familiar. Modern societies have watched empires fall, economies collapse, cities destroyed by war or disaster. Atlantis becomes a symbol of the ultimate loss, the kind that leaves no survivors to tell the full story. But fear alone does not explain the fascination. If it did, Atlantis would repel us rather than draw us in. The story also carries hope, quiet but persistent. Hope that humanity once reached a level of understanding and harmony that we may have forgotten. Hope that greatness is not limited to the present or the future, but has existed before. There is comfort in the idea that we are not the first to dream big, build complex societies, or seek balance between knowledge and nature. This hope often takes different forms. For some, it is the hope of lost knowledge, the idea that ancient civilizations understood things we are only beginning to rediscover. For others, it is the hope that humanity can rise again after collapse, that even if a civilization is destroyed, its legacy can survive in memory and influence future generations. Atlantis, even in its destruction, suggests that brilliance is possible, even if it is temporary. There is also a more personal layer to this fascination. Atlantis reflects our anxiety about identity and meaning. People have always asked whether their time is unique or just another chapter in a long story. Atlantis challenges the idea that we stand at the peak of history. It whispers that others may have stood there before, confident in their achievements, unaware of how close they were to disappearance. That thought humbles us. At the same time, Atlantis flatters us. The fact that we can imagine such a civilization, debate it, and search for it suggests that we see ourselves as capable of understanding and perhaps surpassing it. The story becomes a mirror in which humanity sees both its vulnerability and its ambition. We fear collapse, but we also believe in our ability to learn, adapt, and rebuild. Atlantis also fascinates us because it sits perfectly between mystery and familiarity. It is distant enough to be unknown, but close enough to feel possible. The events described, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, are not supernatural. They are real forces that still shape the world today. This grounding in reality makes Atlantis feel less like fantasy and more like a forgotten chapter, misplaced rather than invented. Another reason Atlantis continues to capture attention is because it allows people to explore big questions safely. Questions about power, morality, and responsibility can be overwhelming when applied directly to modern society. Atlantis provides distance. We can talk about greed, arrogance, and collapse without accusing anyone alive today. We can examine failure without immediate consequences. In this way, Atlantis becomes a safe space for reflection. There is also something deeply human about searching for what is lost. People are drawn to ruins, to abandoned cities, to forgotten histories. They represent time made visible. Atlantis takes this impulse to its extreme. It is the ultimate lost place, a ruin that may not even exist, but whose absence feels meaningful. Searching for Atlantis is not only about finding something, it is about resisting the idea that loss is final. Modern culture has amplified this fascination. Books, films, and documentaries constantly revisit Atlantis, reshaping it to fit contemporary hopes and fears. Sometimes it becomes a warning about environmental destruction. Other times it becomes a symbol of hidden wisdom or advanced technology. Each era recreates Atlantis in its own image, which says less about the ancient past and more about the present moment. Perhaps the most powerful reason Atlantis still fascinates us is because it asks a question without answering it. What happens to us when we forget humility? What happens when power outpaces wisdom? What happens when we assume permanence in a world defined by change? Atlantis doesn't lecture, it simply shows the outcome and leaves us to interpret it. And then there is the final quiet thought that lingers beneath everything else. Maybe Atlantis feels personal because it is, in some way, about us, about our cities, our technologies, our confidence, about the stories future generations might tell if our own world were to change suddenly. Would we be remembered accurately, or would our history be distorted, simplified, turned into legend? Would our greatest achievements survive, or would they sink into obscurity, leaving behind only fragments and speculation? Atlantis forces us to confront the fact that memory is fragile, that history is incomplete, that what we leave behind may not reflect who we truly were. In this sense, Atlantis is not only a story about the past, it is a question aimed at the future. That is why Atlantis refuses to let go of the human imagination. It is not because we want to escape reality, but because Atlantis is deeply rooted in it. It is fear and hope woven together. It is a warning and a dream at the same time. And whether Atlantis ever existed as a physical place matters less than what it continues to reveal about how we see ourselves. Maybe that's the real reason Atlantis still calls to us across the centuries, not because it is lost beneath the sea, but because it lives within us, reflecting our greatest anxieties and our most endearing hopes.
When the excitement, speculation, and imagination surrounding Atlantis are set aside, history asks us to slow down and look carefully at what can actually be confirmed. Not what we wish were true, not what feels dramatic or inspiring, but what evidence allows us to say with confidence. And when we do that, the picture becomes clearer, though no less fascinating. The first and most important fact is this: Plato is the only original source for the story of Atlantis. Every version of the legend that exists today, from ancient writings to modern documentaries, ultimately traces back to the words of Plato. No earlier Greek texts mention Atlantis. No surviving Egyptian records independently confirm it. No inscriptions, tablets, or monuments have ever been found that clearly reference Atlantis by name or description outside Plato's works. This does not automatically mean Plato invented the story, but it does mean that Atlantis, as we know it, enters history through a single voice. For historians, this is a crucial limitation. When reconstructing the past, multiple independent sources strengthen credibility. When only one source exists, especially one written centuries after the supposed events, caution becomes essential. At the same time, Plato was not writing in a vacuum. He lived in a world already shaped by disaster, memory, and loss. Ancient civilizations were frequently affected by earthquakes, floods, droughts, and volcanic eruptions. Entire cities were destroyed and abandoned. Trade networks collapsed. Populations migrated. These events were not rare anomalies. They were recurring realities of the ancient world. Archaeology confirms this again and again. We know that powerful civilizations rose and fell long before Plato's time. We know that coastal settlements were vulnerable to tsunamis. We know that volcanic eruptions could darken skies, destroy agriculture, and destabilize entire regions. These are not speculative ideas. They are supported by physical evidence in the ground, in ice cores, in geological layers, and ruined cities. From this perspective, the destruction described in the Atlantis story is entirely plausible, not in the sense of a specific island named Atlantis, but in the sense that natural disasters have in fact destroyed real ancient civilizations. The suddenness of collapse, the loss of knowledge, and the disappearance of power structures are all well-documented patterns in history. What history does not support is the existence of Atlantis as a global superpower exactly as Plato described it. Despite centuries of searching, no physical proof has ever been found that confirms such a civilization. No ruins beneath the sea that match Plato's detailed description, no unique technology that cannot be traced to known cultures, no artifact that suggests an advanced empire operating beyond the scope of Bronze Age capabilities. This absence of evidence matters. Archaeology does not depend on complete remains. Even civilizations that collapsed violently leave traces: broken tools, foundations, debris, cultural layers. Atlantis, as a distinct and dominant civilization, has left none that can be conclusively identified. This is why historians cannot treat it as confirmed history. But absence of proof does not equal absence of meaning. This is where the Atlantis story often gets misunderstood. To say that Atlantis cannot be proven does not mean it should be dismissed as worthless or irrelevant. On the contrary, its value lies precisely in what it reflects. Atlantis reflects real events. Catastrophic floods and earthquakes left deep impressions on ancient societies. These events were remembered, retold, and reshaped over generations. Oral traditions carried emotional truth even when details shifted. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he may have been capturing the echo of such events, rather than a precise historical record. Atlantis also reflects real fears. Ancient people lived with the constant awareness that nature could erase everything they built. The sea that brought trade could also bring destruction. The earth that supported cities could split without warning. These fears were not abstract, they were lived experiences. Atlantis becomes a narrative expression of that vulnerability. At the same time, Atlantis reflects real hopes. Plato described a society that was once balanced, disciplined, and prosperous. This reflects a belief that humans are capable of building just and organized civilizations. Even in its fall, Atlantis suggests that greatness is possible, even if it is fragile. That idea resonated in the ancient world, and it continues to resonate today. From a historical standpoint, Atlantis occupies a unique space. It is not a verified event, but it is not empty fiction either. It sits between memory and imagination, between disaster and philosophy. It reminds us that history is not only a collection of dates and artifacts, but also a record of how humans understand their own past. Modern historians approach Atlantis not by trying to prove its literal existence, but by asking what conditions could have inspired such a story. They examine known civilizations, known disasters, and known cultural exchanges. They study how stories evolve over time. In doing so, Atlantis becomes a case study in how history is shaped, preserved, and sometimes transformed. This approach leads to a grounded conclusion. Atlantis, as Plato described it, cannot be confirmed as a real physical empire. There is no direct physical proof, but the story itself is not meaningless. It is built from real ingredients: natural catastrophes, human ambition, moral anxiety, and the collapse of power. History often survives not as a perfect record, but as a reflection of experience. When cities fall, people remember the feeling long after the details are lost. When civilizations collapse, stories grow larger than life because the trauma demands expression. Atlantis may be one of those stories, shaped by time into something symbolic, but rooted in genuine human experience. So what does history actually tell us? It tells us to be careful but not dismissive. It tells us to separate evidence from speculation, while still listening to what ancient voices were trying to convey. It tells us that not every powerful story needs to be literally true to be historically significant. Atlantis does not teach us where to dig beneath the ocean. It teaches us how ancient people understood catastrophe, power, and impermanence. It teaches us that memory can survive even when cities do not. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that history is not just about what happened, but about how humanity remembers what happened. In that sense, Atlantis has already achieved something remarkable. Even without physical proof, it continues to inform, provoke, and challenge our understanding of the past. And that alone is enough to give it a lasting place in human history.
Atlantis may never be found beneath the waves. No expedition may ever surface with undeniable ruins. No inscription may ever rise from the sea to silence the debate once and for all. And perhaps that is exactly why Atlantis endures. It does not live in one place. It lives in many places at once, scattered across books and debates, across documentaries and films, across quiet conversations and late-night questions that refuse to fade. Atlantis survives because it adapted. When it could not remain a city of stone, it became a city of thought. When it could not exist as geography, it transformed into meaning. Each generation reshaped it slightly, not out of dishonesty, but out of need. Atlantis became whatever people needed it to be: a warning, a dream, a memory, a mirror. In books, Atlantis often appears as a lost pinnacle of human achievement, a civilization that reached heights we struggle to imagine. Writers return to it again and again because it offers a perfect balance between familiarity and mystery. It feels human, built by human hands, governed by human ambition, yet it is distant enough to escape verification, allowing imagination to roam freely without being restrained by evidence. In debates, Atlantis becomes a test of how we understand history. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about proof, memory, and interpretation. Where does history end and myth begin? How much of the ancient world has been lost forever? How many stories we dismiss today might contain fragments of truth we no longer know how to recognize? Atlantis does not answer these questions. It keeps them alive. In films and popular culture, Atlantis often transforms into spectacle, towers of crystal, advanced machines, secret knowledge. These portrayals may stray far from Plato's original account, but they reveal something important. People are not drawn to Atlantis because of accuracy. They are drawn to it because of possibility. Atlantis represents the idea that humanity is capable of greatness beyond what we currently see, and that this greatness can vanish if it is not protected. But beyond entertainment and speculation, Atlantis survives most powerfully in the questions we still ask today. Questions about sustainability, about power, about humility, about whether progress without wisdom leads to strength or destruction. These questions are not ancient, they are urgent and modern. Atlantis remains relevant because the conditions that inspired its story have never truly disappeared. Perhaps Atlantis was never meant to be discovered in the physical sense. Perhaps it was never meant to be pinned to a map or proven with artifacts. If it were, the story would have ended the moment evidence appeared or failed to appear. Instead, Atlantis continues precisely because it cannot be closed so easily. It resists final answers. There is a quiet wisdom in that resistance. Atlantis reminds us that some stories exist not to be solved, but to be contemplated. It exists in the space between certainty and doubt, where reflection happens. It invites us to imagine what we would do with power, how we would behave in abundance, and whether we would recognize the moment when success begins to turn into arrogance. The story also reminds us of limits. No matter how advanced we become, no matter how complex our systems or how vast our knowledge, we are not separate from the world that sustains us. The same earth that provides resources can withdraw them. The same sea that enables connection can bring destruction. The same confidence that drives innovation can blind us to warning signs. Nature, time, and human arrogance move slowly, but they move relentlessly. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, stands at the intersection of these forces. It is a reminder that collapse does not always arrive with noise and drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, after long periods of comfort, when vigilance has faded and humility has been forgotten. Time, especially, plays a cruel role. Time erases details, smooths edges, and transforms lived experience into story. Cities fall, names disappear, languages die. What remains is often incomplete, distorted, and symbolic. Atlantis may be the product of time's erosion, a memory shaped until only its emotional truth survived. If so, that truth is powerful enough to outlive stone. Human arrogance completes the triangle. Atlantis is not destroyed because it lacks intelligence or skill. It is destroyed because it forgets restraint. This lesson echoes across history. Civilizations rise believing they have mastered their environment, their enemies, and even their future. Then something unexpected happens, and mastery reveals itself as illusion. And yet, Atlantis is not a hopeless story. It does not end with despair. It ends with awareness. By imagining Atlantis, humanity acknowledges vulnerability. By telling its story, humanity admits that greatness without wisdom is fragile. That awareness is a form of survival. Perhaps this is why Atlantis feels so personal. When we talk about it, we are not really talking about the past. We are talking about ourselves, about our cities, our technologies, our confidence in progress, about what we value and what we risk losing. Atlantis asks us to imagine how future generations might remember us, if they remember us at all. Will our world be seen as a triumph of knowledge or a cautionary tale? Will our achievements endure, or will they dissolve into fragments and myths? Will our stories survive intact, or will they be reshaped into something symbolic, something half-remembered, like Atlantis itself? In this sense, Atlantis is not behind us, it is beside us. It walks quietly alongside every civilization that believes it has reached permanence. It whispers that nothing built by humans is immune to time. It reminds us that survival depends not only on intelligence, but on humility, balance, and respect for forces larger than ourselves. So perhaps Atlantis does not need to be found. Perhaps it has already done its work. It has lived long enough to become more than a city. It has become a question humanity keeps asking, a reflection humanity cannot escape. And as long as we continue to build, to strive, to push the boundaries of what is possible, Atlantis will remain with us, not beneath the waves, but within our imagination. Quiet, patient, and enduring. A reminder that no matter how advanced we become, nature, time, and human arrogance always have the final word.